Okay. Okay, so I think let's start. Again, we enjoyed it so much last week that we've asked Rabbi Uzvolk for an encore. We've asked him to come back again tonight. And whereas last week focused primarily on tefillin, we thought we'd use tonight to be a bit more general about the general role of a sofer, of which Rabbi Uzvolk is a certified sofer stam, and just maybe focusing on a Sefer Torah, and maybe allow for a lot more just general questions, any questions that you may have. But I also just wanted to dedicate this particular shiur, this learning, Mandy Steinberg, Le'ilu Nishmas Malka Bat Abraham, that her neshama should have an aliyah. Dear Mandy Steinberg, Malka Bat Abraham. So Rabbi Uzvolk, once again, thank you. If I can maybe just ask a couple of questions. I don't see that particular person who asked them online now, but I'll send you the recording. I'll just ask you, if you don't mind, just a couple just from last week. And then please, by all means, you'll just maybe start maybe with a general introduction, software, Sefer Torah, and then if you'll be kind enough just to open up for questions. But just following on from last week, so the one question is, again, regarding the tefillin, she asks, presume a knife or sharp blade or sharp instrument is allowed to be used in the manufacture, cutting of the hide. So I guess the question is, can one use any type of knife, any type of blade for cutting, for the manufacturing of the tefillin?
Like I said, hello everybody, firstly, and welcome back.
Evening.
So I'm not a tefillin macher. I've been to an actual tefillin factory, and I cannot remember how they started off with a hide. But the first step that I saw in the factory was this quite a big hide. In fact, it might have been taken from the head of the animal, and presumably to get to that point of having a square piece of hide or whatever shape it is, a knife has been used. I mean, it depends how far back in the process you go. For the shchita, obviously a knife is used. For skinning the animal and getting the hide off, yes, knives are used. So there are knives used, but at I think very early on in the process of the tefillin, there's no necessity to use a knife. It's more in terms of pressing it into its shape over a mold, and then sandpapering it down using electric sandpapers. So you could call that a knife, I suppose, and getting it into the perfect square shape.
Okay, great. And again, as you said, you don't specialize. You import the batim, so you're not making them yourself. But you probably can answer this one about Uzvolk. She asks, just regarding the shin on the shell rosh, how's that done? How's that made? She puts here a quill. Is there any particular way that that's done? That shin needs to be put onto the shell rosh?
So that's a very nice question. And just going back to the previous question, you've seen, especially the men that are lucky enough to stand close to a Torah, you've seen that the lines are very, very straight, even though there aren't any lines. Those lines are made with, they kind of scratched into the clough. We call it les sartate, sirtut. And we specifically try not to use a knife for that, for two reasons. Number one, we don't want to pierce the clough. And number two, we don't want to, the tefillin have got an aspect of like a mizbeach, an altar, that we don't want to bring a knife onto building the altar. So I'll just show you on a piece of parchment that I'm actually busy with. I've just started writing another mezuzah. It's going to be very hard to see, but there are fine lines that are kind of, like I say, scratched into this clough. That's how we get it so straight. and there we don't use a knife. We'll use a piece of glass, a sharp stone, even our thumbnail to make those lines. They come with lines, but sometimes the lines get erased and we need to redo them. Then going on to what you just asked me now, again, remind me.
The shin.
The shin. One of the reasons that the bayit is so holy as a bayit, and it's not just a box, is because it has got that shin. That shin is part of the writing, and it has to follow to the extent possible the laws of writing that shin. So it's actually part of when they mold that that hide into the shape of the bayit, the shin is kind of pressed out, and then while the hide is still soft because it's been soaking for so long, you go around the letters and you kind of press out the letter, bring out the letter.
Brilliant. And then let me just ask you, like I said, she's got a whole host of questions here, but I don't want to get bogged in what we just. I'll pick out one more. She asks, is there a specific method in the order of assembling the tefillin?
So like I said last week, there was a question about Rashi's tefillin and Rabbeinu Tam's tefillin. So in the order of assembling the tefillin in, that means taking the parchment, those parashiyot, and putting them in. It's a very specific order and very specific method. Just to give you an example, that firstly it's rolled like a mezuzah from back to front. It's also put in vertically, not horizontally. Then I told you last week that we use hair of a tail to wrap around that parchment. Okay, so the hand tefillin, we do it this way, whereas the head tefillin, we do them on the vertical circumference. So the one is the horizontal or middle circumference, so to speak, and the one is a vertical circumference. Even the way we tie the hair has got a specific method.
Great, fantastic, Rabbi Uzvolk. I don't know if you want to maybe give a general intro into tonight and then possibly open it up. We'll be guided by you, please.
Okay, so thank you, Rabbi, and welcome everybody to this. And I hope that we come away with just some excitement about what it means to have the privilege of being a people that have a Torah. If I could bring that home, just that idea, then I think we've accomplished something. We're starting 7:30, finishing at 8:30. So I'll talk till about 8:10, so that there's more time for questions. And if I'm finished with what I've got to say, and then it rather goes in a conversation, I'm also okay with that. You know, we had a bat mitzvah some time ago at our shul, and the thing that happened that frightens so many gaboim happened at our shul, and that is that you've got all the guests around, and we have an aliyah, and we found a mistake in the Torah. And now, it's so embarrassing, we've got to take out another Torah. And I then turned that situation around, and I showed how tremendously beautiful our heritage is. Because really, what we are saying is that if one letter is read incorrectly in the Torah, then that Torah is not valid. That Torah is pasul. And we have a kind of an inbuilt way of ensuring that no mistakes have crept into the Torah over the generations, precisely by the fact that we read the Torah in public, in a minyan, and people follow with their text, and they'll shout out, they'll say, hey, you read that word incorrectly. Sometimes they're more polite than others, but the point is that the communities don't let a mistake go by. And that means that if there is a word that is miswritten, the chances are that it's going to get picked up. So that people can't say that, you know what, how do you know that this is the same Torah asher sam Moshe lifnei bnei Yisrael? This is the Torah that Moshe put before bnei Yisrael. And I'm saying that this is the Torah. This is a copy, a hand copy of a hand copy of a hand copy, all the way back till the 13 Torahs that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote. He wrote one Torah for each tribe, and one Torah was kept next to the Aron, the holy Aron Kodesh. That's what it was called. There's a machloket, an argument, was this the shelf that held this Torah inside the Aron or on the outside of the Aron. But think about it. We've got this Torah, each letter has been copied in an exact way, all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu. The Rambam already. And when he's living in what? About 1050, about 1,000 years ago. He's already talking about the Torah that exists in Cairo or in Alexandria. That shul has tradition that it's from Ezra the scribe. He talks about that. That's what he's printing. Ezra the scribe. This is people of our own Tanakh. So what I was saying to this bat mitzvah girl is that you as a bat mitzvah boy, girl, are part of a heritage where every single letter, and read that as every single Jew, counts. One letter invalidates the entire Torah. This is the richness that we have. So next time when the congregation sing out Vezot HaTorah Asher Sam Moshe Lifnei Bnei Yisrael, it is unbelievable pride that we should have, that this is the Torah that we have. By the way, that verse Vezot HaTorah Asher Sam Moshe was actually, it's a quote from the Torah itself, and it's not talking about the Torah, it's talking about the law of the city of refuge, which is another important aspect of what Torah is. Torah is meant to be a refuge, a place that a Jew finds a comfort, refuge from all the turbulence of the world. Zot HaTorah. That means this is a city of refuge that the Jew has always had. Okay, so that's the first idea in terms of this tradition, this continuity that we have. There's so much so that there's one word in the Torah that is pronounced as daka, which means crushed. And there is an argument if that word daka is written with an aleph or with a hay. So we do have an argument over one letter. Some traditions go with the aleph, some go with a hay. And there's a comment that goes, I saw it written, that the Torah that was used by the Maharal of Prague had an aleph in it. So in other words, these are the kind of things that scholars were looking out for. You know, what is that? Can we find the latest version in order to ascertain, are we going in the right tradition or not? Nowadays, it's much easier because we've got such immediate communication. So, you know, we communicate with the entire world as soon as we've got questions. But it used to be far more difficult. And if a person did develop a mistake over years, it could have taken a long time till it got picked up. But nonetheless, it was picked up. Okay, just some of the laws of the Torah. It says that Moshe, when he got up to Har Sinai, he found Hashem tying crowns onto the letters, as if this was God's occupation, tying crowns onto the letters. We call it a keter, or we also call them tagim. And if you've stood up close at a Torah, you'll see that the letters have got these crowns on them. And again, there's a very specific tradition that ties us back, all the way back, which letters get these crowns, get these tagim, and in fact, how they're written. Just to go into some of the detail of it, which I just find so beautiful. But let me try to see in this, not a Torah, in a Megillah, so that you can remember what I'm talking about. I don't know if you could see clearly. If you look on top of a shin, for instance, a shin is one of those letters that needs a crown. I don't know if it's coming up clearly. So there are 3 crowns, there are 3 tagim, and even within the crowns, the right is longer than the left, and the middle is the longest, and that represents also Kabbalistically, the right represents the side of chesed and kindness, and that should be longer than the side of the left, which represents severity, and the middle, which represents emet, truth. By the way, on your tefillin as well, the straps that come down, the right strap is longer than the left strap for that same reason. The right is kindness and the left is severity. So that's a bit about the crowns. What does it mean that God is tying crowns to the letters? So perhaps an idea is that the crowns represent God's royalty, and he's connecting his royalty to these letters. We've got certain rules in the way we actually write. So it says kitvu lachem et hashira hazot, write the song. In fact, that's the origin for us having to write a Torah, and there are opinions that every person is supposed to write their own Torah, and that the king had a second Torah. One of the famous commentators, the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, he says that the whole purpose of writing a Torah was in order to know the Torah. And nowadays that we've got books, Sfarim, we fulfill that obligation by owning Jewish books in our home. But that would be the reason, a very compelling reason to actually own Jewish books. Others say that actually we are supposed to own a Torah. So how do you own a Torah? Well, when you belong to a shul that has a Torah, and especially if you pay membership to that shul, that becomes a kind of an ownership that you have in that Torah. There are opinions that learn it that way, and they say that when you are being called up to the Torah, that's like making the showing the ownership that you as an individual have over the Torah. But it's interesting that it's written kitvu lachem et hashira hazot. The Torah is called the song, and we need to write the song. But from the same word kitvu, to write, we learn that it's got to be written in the way that things are written. And this is actually a very important point, because nowadays there are schemers, and just like you get false goods often from China, without being critical about China, you even get mezuzahs and Torahs that are printed in China. They look beautiful, but they simply not written. They were printed, or they were silk screened. That's becoming quite a problem. So it's got to be written, number one, not printed, not silk screened. And in terms of writing, we come to another interesting part of the writing that a scribe needs to know. I suppose he's scribing, he's writing, and that is that you need to form the letter directly with the ink, not scratch away the ink to create a letter. Do you get that? I'll give you an example. Look at the letter Hey. If you rub away the left leg of the Hey, you'd be left with a resh, correct? It would look similar to a resh. But that resh is not kosher, because it wasn't written as a resh. It became a resh by scratching away the ink. Okay? So you have to form the letters in the appropriate way of writing and not scratch away the ink to form the letter. A very important aspect of what a scribe has to know, because there are times that, let's say, like I said last week, you could be writing with your quill and a drop of ink falls over a letter and kind of now blotches out that letter. So you can't just scratch away that ink to form the letter. because then you haven't written the letter. You need to write the letter in an active, constructive way, not by just scratching away the ink. Also, every letter, every single letter needs hakofis. It needs to be surrounded by white cloth for it to be kosher. And that's very important, because if two letters touch each other, then even if they touch each other very thickly, then you've actually misformed the letter, and then the Torah is totally invalid. But if they touch just very lightly, then you haven't misformed the letter, but you have a problem that each letter is not surrounded all the way with white cloth. Or sometimes on a mezuzah, not so much in a Torah, but the scribe might have had a long letter, like, I don't know, a nun sofit, and just gone too long and gone to the edge of the cloth. And then that bottom of that nun is not surrounded by the cloth anymore. So every letter has to be surrounded by the cloth. It could be that it's the idea. There's a midrash that talks about black fire on white fire. That's an image that I think Moshe saw the Torah as, with black fire on white fire. The white fire is significant as well, what we call mukaf gavil, that it's surrounded by the parchment. And again, one of the other laws that a sofer has to be careful with is that if you make a mistake on God's name, you can't rub out that name. That is the real prohibition about erasing Hashem's name. And in a mezuzah, that becomes problematic, especially in a mezuzah. I'll tell you why. When it comes to tefillin and mezuzahs, every word has to be written in order, because it says vehayu hadvarim ha'ele. These words shall be, and the Gemara learns they shall be in their order. Vehayu, in the way that they are, hoveh, the way they are, each one letter after the other in its exact sequence. So if you make a mistake, you realize a mistake, you'd have to go back to the mistake, rub out, and that's hard to rub out, but you use a knife or a blade, you scratch out the ink, and you continue from where you made your mistake. But what happens if your mistake, you've already written Hashem's name? You're not allowed to erase Hashem's name. So then that mezuzah remains forever invalid, pasul. Thankfully, that law does not exist with the writing of a Torah. In a Torah, the words don't have to be written in order, because it doesn't say concerning the Torah, vehayu hadvarim ha'ele. So therefore, if you made a mistake, you could just go back to that mistaken word and fix up that word where you made your mistake. Okay, one more halacha that's got to do with the community, and then I'll open up to the questions. You see, it's much, there's less things to show, as in with the tefillin. It's very important when we talk about kriyat haTorah, reading the Torah. When we read the Torah, it's important that every single word is read from the Torah. Now, that might sound straightforward, but the way we read is not that way. Our eyes are ahead of our mouth. So when we're reading, we're actually reading a bit ahead of what our mouth is saying. That is not a valid way of reading the Torah. And that's why we need that pointer, because the pointer keeps our eyes on the letter that we are uttering. The Baal Koreh has to be careful when he finishes a line or a column that he doesn't jump to the next column before finishing to pronounce the word that he's saying, because every word has to be written from inside the Torah. Okay, that's the reading of the Torah. Now, there's a custom that you might be aware of. I'm sure you are aware of. When a person gets an aliyah to the Torah, and you say the brachas. Baruch hu et Hashem havorach asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natananu et Torato. So you don't look at the Torah when you say those words. Some people even close the Torah. Some people leave the Torah open, but they look to the side. Why is that so important? Because nobody should think that those brachot are written in the Torah. Because if any word like that was written in the Torah, it means you've added a word to the Torah, and then the Torah is invalid. We said right at the beginning that the Torah that we have today is precisely the same Torah that Moshe gave to the Jews then. In fact, it's part of the principles of faith, the ani mamins that we said at the end of Shachrit, that this Torah lo teh muchlefet, or in the Yigdal, lo yachalif ha'el velo yamir dato. God will never change his dat, this religion. Nothing will be changed in it. Nothing in the Torah could be changed. So the brachas cannot be written in the Torah, and hence we close the Torah and we say the brachas. And some people some communities have got the custom to leave the Torah open, and the reason is not to cause a delay on the community, what we call tircha de tzibura. We don't want to keep the community waiting while the Baal Koreh finds the place, which is a very amazing sensitivity that we need to have to communal time. By the way, that's why there's certain times of the year that we take out 2 Torahs and we don't just roll to the next place, because we can't keep the community waiting. That's called tircha de tzibura. If you only have 1 Torah, then there's nothing that we could do. But ideally, we would, if there's a Torah reading from a different place, then we take out a 2nd Torah. Okay, let me stop with my talking and open up for questions.
Please, if anyone has a question, just unmute and fire away. Aubrey. Aubrey, we can't hear you. Aubrey, we can't hear you.
I see Maya had a question.
Maya, you want to try? Maya, just unmute. Maya, unmute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. If one makes a mistake in the Torah, in fact, I spoke to our Rabbi about it today. Is the Torah not made out of different portions? And I asked the question, is it not possible just to take that portion out, or does the whole Torah have to be rewritten? That's one question.
Okay, so absolutely. In a Torah, the mistake can be fixed up. The mistake can be fixed up. And if you've got too many mistakes on one, it's called in Hebrew a yeri'ah, which means like one sheet.
Yeah.
Let's say you've got one sheet which is just, it got messed up. You can replace that one sheet.
Okay.
But I'm going a bit more lenient than you. If there's a mistake on one sheet that's fixable, you don't have to replace that sheet. You just fix up that word.
And okay, I'm just asking, I've got just 2 more questions. If there's you mentioned about a bar mitzvah you had, and you picked up a word that was incorrect. I mean, how long did you have that Torah? And surely you didn't come across that portion only once that you would pick it up. Do you understand what I mean? Well, what? No, I'm not. Please, I'm not. I just want to know. So
I must tell you that there's a number of factors. When a person prepares the laning, and I know your rabbi and how he prepares his laning. He's been doing it for many, many, many years. By now, there are sections that are almost verbatim, almost off by heart.
Oh, I see. But
now he's not allowed to read off by heart. He has to train himself to read. But
he has to read each word. You have to read.
You have to read each word.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, the mind plays tricks. you know, you look at a letter, it looks exactly a bet and a chaf.
Yes.
And you suddenly realize, hey, that little chupchuk at the back of the chaf, that back leg is not there.
Can happen.
Or the chaf has got a bit of it's too angular, so it's now not a chaf, it's a bet. Or a resh is a dalet.
Yeah.
Or a yud is a bit too long. And when you look at it from this angle, you see that it's actually, it's a questionable vav. Or a zayin is a nun sofit. There's some letters that look so similar to one another. Number one. Number two, the pressure that the Baal Korah is under in reading is immense.
Yeah.
To read correctly and to look for the mistakes, it is hard. It's not. I don't think that any Baal Koreh or any shul that's had a Torah for many years and a mistake hasn't been picked up should be embarrassed. Plus, there is. No, I know that you mean it in a absolutely honest way. There is a reality of sometimes ink just peeling off or scratching off. That happens with age.
Sure. Yeah. All right. I forgive. Can I just say
one more?
One more, Rodney. I'll give you the rest tomorrow. Crowns on words. Is you spoke about the crowns on words. Is it only on a shin or on all the words? All the letters?
The traditional letters are what we call sha'atnez guts. The shin, ayin, tet, nun, zayin, gimel, tzadik, sofit.
Those have the crowns.
Yes.
And the rest not. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
There are some other exceptions, but those are the ones that have.
Thank you for answering me. Thank you.
Stuart, you're up.
Can I ask you a question?
I think let's just, please go ahead. Yes. Thank you so much for joining.
Hello, Ma.
Hi. You know, when you say that, how long does it can take a few years, or that a Sefer Torah can be in the Aron Kodesh and it can't be picked up? Because if there are a few Sifrei Torah, only one of them is chosen. It's like the muzzle of the Torah. So surely, you know, it can take, sometimes it so happens that the same Torah is picked up for 5, 6, 7 years, and on another year that you pick up another Torah and you find, so it can be there for a few.
With you, look, it happens. I understand that. I was just curious to know. Yeah.
And I mean, just on that point, they tell us that even a Sefer Torah needs muzzle.
Yeah.
Stuart?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to know, how do you correct a mistake? If you make a mistake, do you rub it out, or do you wash it out, or what? And how long does it take you to do a parsha, say, for example, or a Torah to write?
So, Stuart, thank you. I spent some time in London as an apprentice, and this teacher told me, he said, you'll become an expert when you know how to fix up mistakes. That the sign of an expert is not when you write perfectly, but when your fixing up of the mistakes leaves a clear paper behind, a clear parchment behind. It is difficult. It doesn't rub out with a regular rubber. You need to scratch it out, and to be careful not to scratch a hole into the parchment. Sometimes we could even use those like electric rubbers. They spin around. Otherwise, a regular blade, like this is where I write from. So I have blades. I have normal blades with me. A good old blade. And you could see it's black on the edges from rubbing out some letters. Sometimes I even use very fine sandpaper. Very fine, like, the higher numbers. This is a 1200. And I fold it into a very small area. There are people that are really have an expertise that they could peel off the entire letter. I've never managed to do that, but some people could actually peel it off. So that's how we fix mistakes. Worst case scenario is that you end up making a hole in the parchment and actually have to cut out a window and then put that word into Geniza, Seamus, stick parchment from behind, and then rewrite onto that parchment.
Anyone else?
Hear you.
Can I ask you something, Rabbi? Hello, can you hear me?
Go ahead.
Oh, yes. What about the concept of like a proofreader? You know, like when for like important, like I'm sure like constitutions of governments would have like a proofreader. Is there no such a concept like that in writing of the Torah?
Thank you very much. In the profession of a sofer, we're not supposed to sell a mezuzah, a tefillin, or a Torah until it's been both computer checked and checked by another scribe. The computer check is to see that you haven't missed out any letters or added any letters, and it's a computer program that scans the text, and then the scribe is to see that the letters are, you know, halachically correct as well.
Yes, but that being said, I mean, computers, how long has that been used?
Right.
Modern.
So I'd say, good point. Good point. It used to be that there were two types of checks that another scribe would do. One of them was basically counting the letters. So let's say our mezuzah text is very there's a very clear structure for mezuzah and tefillin. How many words on a line and what those words are. So you would know how many letters are supposed to be on every line. And without even looking what those letters are, in fact, you might even get somebody who's not got an understanding of what the letters mean, but rather can identify 1, 2, 3, 4, count the letters, just to see that there's not missing and no extra and no missing letters. And then to read over it again with another scribe. And I'll come to another interesting point that I'm sure you've heard of the concept of asking a child. Sometimes we have a letter and we're not sure. And we know that we might be too subjective in making a decision. So we call a child who can identify letters, but does not know the meaning of the word. And we ask him, is that a, what letter is that? A
Rather
taf,
than
aleph, whatever it is.
You asked what letter is that rather than auto-suggesting, is it this or is it that?
Correct.
So
what letter is that?
Sorry, Rabbi, you didn't answer the question about the computer program, which I found fascinating.
No, so I'm saying that before the computer program, we would just count letters. Now that we have a computer program, we have to use the best technology available.
Yes, and how long has that computer program been available?
Since I'm in the trade, it's definitely been here the past, I'm in it for 5 years. I'd say 20 years. By now, 20 years at least.
Brilliant. Okay. Thank you. That's really interesting. Thank you, Rabbi.
Just a couple of questions. If a letter of the Yud...
Aubrey, just try again. Just if you can scream, because it's very, very faint. Go for it.
Hello, rabbis.
Hello.
You hear me now. One big question. If it's Hashem's name and you have to correct a letter, it's cracked, it needs a little tail on the end or something. Can you do it, or is it possible?
If it's a matter of adding ink to one of the letters in Hashem's name, then we can do that. And remember, you asked me last week, do you need to go to the mikveh before? And yes, you are now fixing up God's name. You need to have been to the mikveh, and you need to make a declaration before that little adjustment, what's called l'shem kedushat shem Hashem, for the sake of the holiness of God's name. And then you add that little bit of ink.
Okay,
But
so
there
now-
are some times when we can't just add ink, and we're in a problem because we can't scratch away ink, because we can't detract from, from God's name. I'll give you an example. God's name, Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey. Now, you wrote the Vav very thick. But if you ask a child what letter it is, he could still read it as a Vav. But you want to make it look nicer, so you want to scratch it and make it thinner. You can't do that because it's already a Vav. The child called it a Vav. That means it's God's name. So you can't scratch away to make it look better. So there's just many details around Hashem's name in the Torah.
Okay, the other thing is, no one seems to have raised at all. What is, I would say, the average cost, or what is the cost range of a Torah today?
Aubrey, for you, I'll give it at a special price.
Love to afford one, but seriously, what is the total cost these days?
Okay, so the cost today, from what I've understood, I've never written a Torah yet. It ranges around $50,000.
That's the cloth only. That's no embellishments. That's no mantle, no bells, no effort, no. Maybe it includes Eitz Chaim, so I don't even know if it would.
Correct. Now, how would I get to that that calculation? So let me give you an example, okay? Sure. This book is called. This is from our Bar Mitzvah. It's called a Tikkun.
Okay,
A Tikkun Sofrim. Okay? And that's a column of Torah writing next to regular writing. Now, if you look at one column, a mezuzah is about half of that. The size of a mezuzah is half a column. Okay? It takes an experienced scribe about 3 to 4 hours to write one mezuzah. So that means that to write a column is going to take a minimum of 6 hours. And that's not counting if there's a mistake that happens and he has to redo it. So now you have to work out how many columns are there in a Torah. So there are about 250 columns in a Torah. So that's the amount of hours that it's taking, besides for the material that is being used. So a person that's going to write a Torah is going to have to designate almost a full year, about 6 to 8 hours a day in order to write a Torah. That's where that cost is coming.
No, that makes sense. And the mezuzah and tefillin?
So a mezuzah is 2 paragraphs. A tefillin is 4 paragraphs times 2. Right? So work that out. Right? If a mezuzah, so it's 8 paragraphs as opposed to 2. So it's about 4 times the writing time of a mezuzah. About 12 hours. But again, with the problem with the tefillin is that a mistake means you've got to go back to the beginning. That's
right.
The easier part of a Torah. A Torah, you don't have to go back to the beginning.
You say it's because of what it says in the Shema that you cannot correct tefillin, okay? The klaf on the tefillin.
Vehayu. That word vehayu hadvarim ha'ele. These words will be as they are.
Right. So it doesn't matter at what stage you are, whether you're before Hashem's name, after, that's it. If there's a mistake, it goes to Geneza, right?
Yes. Well, if you haven't written Hashem's name, then you could rub out back to that mistake and continue from there.
That's on for tefillin and mezuzah. Is that correct?
Yes.
And now, what about a get? Why is a get also in that league? That if there's a mistake, it's scrapped.
Okay. It says concerning a get, v'chatav la sefer kritut, that if a man divorces a woman, he will write for her a sefer kritut, a book of cutting off. So it's got that expression of v'katav and the sefer. So a lot of the laws of writing a get are learned from Torah, and writing a Torah are learned from a get.
Okay, Hashem's name appears in a get.
No.
I thought so, because they cut the get. They actually cut it.
Correct.
And they cut the cloth. So what happens to that? Does that go to Seamus? Oh, it should. I mean, it hasn't got a
It doesn't have to. It doesn't have to go to Seamus. I think it's stored in the actual beit in that it should not be used. You know, there might be another person by the name of Shimon and another woman who's married to a Rachel, and they want to use it again, and that's not good, because it says v'chatav la. He will write it for her specifically.
That's why it's cut.
Should not be used again.
Just to explain again, you say that the cloth that goes into the tefillin, into the rosh, it's put in vertically into the bayit. Okay. With the writing at the top, the word starting at the top, working its way down to the base.
Yes.
On tefillin, you say it's also put in vertically.
It's also put in vertically, correct. But the hair is tied the other way around.
When you say the other way around, if you've got a scroll and you roll it up this way, you're going to tie it that way over there, not this way over here, surely.
Well, for the head one, you will go in the vertical way.
But then it can still open. It's just holding it. It's going to open up.
We actually fold it. We don't roll it. It's like folded, one fold over the other.
Okay, and then what I've seen, and I think it goes back a long time, my memory is correct. The tefillin, when my tefillin were apostle years ago, they were not tied with hair. They were wrapped with plastic, like a mezuzah is sometimes, rolled up in clear plastic and put into the cover.
If I would see that today, I would show all my contemporaries and ask, where's this coming from? Where's that? Where did it come from? Because it's something that I've never heard of.
So it has to be hair. What about git? Can you use git to tie it up?
Maybe.
Would you use git to tie up the cloth, like you sew the tefillin with?
Maybe it could be. But the hairs that stick out, that specifically has to be hair. You remember I told you the tefillin of the Rosh have got that in the front of it.
Right.
That has to be hair. Halacha leMoshe miSinai.
Okay. Now the batim.
So hold a second. So I know Stuart's been waiting.
Separate pieces pushed together. Was it one piece?
Last one.
It's four. The batim of the head are four separate that are squeezed together.
Not glued at all.
Ideally no glue. That's also depending on how mehudar the tefillin are.
Stuart, you had another question?
Yes, thank you. Can more than one person write a single Torah? And can they start at any particular place? Or have you got to start at Bereshit and work your way through?
Very nice question. Strictly speaking, you can. In terms of many writers, many scribes, you can. The chances are that it won't look so beautiful, because every scribe has got a little nuance that's different to his neighbor. That's just the way it is. It's not printed. It's very hard, even the scribe himself, to remain consistent with his writing, the thickness of the letters, the pressure that he puts on the nib, even the quill, every time you cut it, every feather is a different feather. So you can have many scribes, but the chances are that it won't look so nice. In terms of starting the Torah anywhere, definitely you can. And often, I know that when it comes to Megillas, we actually don't start from the beginning because we allow ourselves to get into it. So we don't. So we leave the best for last. And you write
Thank
the
you.
beginning actually at the end.
Mitch, if you want to unmute yourself.
Okay. A couple of questions, Rabbi. First of all, are you particularly artistic in terms of drawing other things, or did you have a specific interest in Hebrew letters? And at what age did you decide, okay, this is now quite an interesting and nice job for you?
Thanks for the question. Thank God I'm talented. I draw and paint very nicely.
Good question.
And the scribing has been a beautiful way of combining art with very specific halakha. I've found it a beautiful journey.
Okay. From Israel, or do you get
Start
it?
again.
The ink, does it come from Israel, or do you get it locally?
I don't know. I don't know if you could get it locally. There's quite a traditional recipe, and it's almost a secret, a family secret that people have got how to make that ink. It's like in the times of the temple, there were families who knew exactly how to mix the ktoret, the incense, and to get the oil right. And they didn't want to give over the secrets to other families within the Kohanim families. And I think that the same kind of mystery exists with the ink. There's specific leaves that are used, that they burn them, and then they use the ashes to get the blackness, and they use a bit of a sap so that it's got like a kind of a glue that attaches to the parchment. And so we just buy the ink.
Okay. And question number 3 is, when you're writing, do you have to have a certain attire on? Or surely you can't just wear anything when you're writing anything.
Good question.
The laws of modesty for sure have to apply. You've got a mezuzah, you've got Hashem's name in front of you, so you definitely have to be modest. And you know, this is an example where people say, you know, what if something's kosher, then it's kosher. Why does it have to be mahadrin? But there are some